Hey everybody, and welcome back to Church at Home with Rachel for, I think this is Thursday, 8th? 8th? Oh, today is Rob's birthday. Happy birthday, sweetheart. He won't watch this, so he won't hear me, so oh well. Earlier this week on Monday, on Red Dress Day, I talked about the missing murdered women and Indigenous girls in Canada and the Red Dress Day and how we think about that and how we think about racism and how we have to become more aware. I'd like to talk today about a little bit about our own work that Canada has been doing, the churches have been doing to change the script, not to alter the script, to write a new ending or to continue the storytelling. I remember back. I'm getting coming up next week on my the 26th anniversary on my ordination to the diaconate, and I'm thinking a lot about that. I'm also going back next week to Huron University College, where I will be given an Honorary Doctorate of Divinity diploma degree. And Huron is very much part of my upbringing. It's where I went to seminary. It is the diocese I was ordained into and worked in for the first 9 years. It's where my family lives, and I've lived most of my life there, growing up. And I remember I've been thinking a lot about this lately about because we have Sacred Circle coming up in the Anglican Church of Canada in August at the University of Calgary. And I'm thinking a lot about my Indigenous siblings and the role that the Indigenous Church plays and the role that the Anglican Church of Canada in our sort of settler colonial style plays with the Indigenous Church. And remembering back to when I was being in seminary, I didn't hear much about it, wasn't paying that close attention. But once it was ordained and I was getting the notices, and we didn't get many emails back then. It used to be a whack of paper that would come out in the mail. But telling us like we were doing a lot of fundraising for at that time because the diocese I was in was in a lawsuit about residential schools. And so there was a whole lot of hunker down, research the archives, do the work of finding out what it is, how we are culpable if we are, what role did we play or what role did we not play. And the diocese, all eyes were sort of on the diocese because it was the first sort of test case, I think, or maybe second or third, but it was pretty significant. And so the first year or two of my ministry were sort of focused on all of this. And it was very much a protect ourselves, protect the church kind of mentality. We were raising money to make sure that we could pay for the lawsuit, for the research, things like that. And then in the end, it turns out that we didn't need that. Other people had helped. And then came the discussion about how do we contribute to a healing fund for those people who had been in the residential schools in Canada, whose lives had been completely shattered, and who we now recognize intergenerational trauma, the impact that those residential schools had on the students that were there, which then continued to trickle down through the generations after that. Think of it. If you were stolen from your family, in some cases, the families indeed said, please take my child, because they were going to go to school. They would learn English, the language of the rest of the country. They were going to teach them things. They were going to give them trades, things that they could do. In some cases, the children were stolen from their families. In lots of cases, the children were taken from their families without the families giving permission. There's many different stories, and I do encourage you to check out the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the work that they did. I am only scratching the surface myself in my understanding, but I have made this a lifelong learning for myself that I cannot give myself permission to get off the hook. We've already done that part. This will be a part of who I am until the day I take my last breath. And so this idea that the residential schools did such incredible damage, not just to the person, taking away their language, cutting their hair, stripping them of their identity of who they were, teaching them that they were wrong, and at minimum, abusing them by removing their identity and their cultural sense of who they were. Because we're living in a world where we're really aware of what our culture is and how important that is. But the idea was to eliminate the Indian from the child, to make them, assimilate them into real society. We know now how wrong and horrific that was. But this is what was happening, in many cases with great intention and in some cases with great horrific intention. Not only were children stripped of their culture and their identity, they were abused emotionally, psychologically, many of them sexually abused. They were treated like slave labor in many cases. There are stories of success of young people who grew up, who learned English, who appreciated the way that they were treated because not everyone was horrible. But there are more and more stories about people whose lives were hurt. And then think of that. You're a 5 or 6 year old who's taken away from your loving parents, from a community where the village really does raise a child, the grandparents, the cookums, the aunties, the uncles, everybody contributes. You're taken away from that. You're not allowed to see your brothers and sisters. You're not allowed to speak your language. There's no one to hug you or to kiss your knee when you fall down and get a boo-boo. Your older sibling can't even help you out or chat with you and tell stories about remember when after supper at night. And then you grow up without parents. You grow up not knowing what it is to be loved. You grow up knowing that you ache or hurt or there's something missing, or worse even than that, you are physically hurting every day. And that becomes your norm. And now you grow up, you run away, you get free of the school, or you just graduate and you're in the world and you meet someone and you hook up with them and maybe you get married or you start a relationship. And how do you, when you've never learned how to love, how do you enter into a relationship with that person? And when you start to have children, how do you raise them when you've never seen or experienced, except for when you were a little small child, what it was to raise a child in love, to teach a child what it is to learn how to tie your shoes or go skating, to skip a rope, to give them a birthday cake. And here we start with intergenerational trauma. The church in Canada is looking toward, the Indigenous church in Canada is looking toward Sacred Circle and the beginning of a way of life that is parallel to, I think, but separate than, but self-determining. They look at the church, they look at the gospel of Jesus Christ, and they say, what does that mean to us within our traditions, within who we are, what it is naturally, who Creator made us to be, how we think, how we make decisions, because it is inherently different to be Indigenous than it is to be white. Just as I think it's inherently different than to have grown to be inherently, a Scottish person deep down, or a Ukrainian person, or an African. We all have those things that seem to be part of our DNA that we don't understand, but we accept because, hey, it's who I am. Well, the Indigenous people are like that as well. And they have the right, and they should have the right, to be able to discover who they are as children of God and what their expression of their love for God, what their relationship with Jesus Christ looks like, and hence the self-determining church and Sacred Circle. And they are coming to that place where they are learning, they're coming together and learning to do this. And they have been so gracious in inviting the rest of us to come along, to join them. It's not about you hurt us, so now you go over here. It's yes, you hurt us, but how do we walk in a new way? How do we walk in a good way? And part of that means that those of us who are not part of the Indigenous tradition, community, need to accept the fact that this is not ours to control. For those of us who are used to the white, the WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, or the colonial style of things, there are ways we do things, decision-making things, the way power is handed out, the way we defer to others, which is completely different than the traditional ways of Indigenous people. And even within the Indigenous community, there are different communities that have different ways of doing things, just as there are for us. Like I said, Ukrainian, Scottish, German, African, Cree, Ojibwe, Mohawk, Iroquois, like all of these different things. They are all just as equally important and different and unique as all of our white people ways or brown people, black people ways of being. We need to acknowledge that. And in Canada, we've been working at this for a long time. And as a church, we have been working on it for a long time. When I say long time, that's just a drop in the bucket for what the Indigenous people have been talking about. They talk about 7 generations. It has not been 7 generations yet. We are first and second generation, and we need to look ahead with them to that 7th generation where times will have changed, where people will be who they were called to be once again. And I think it's important for us to remember, just as we remembered on Monday, the Red Dress Day, the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and those people who have just treated like they were nothing, and it was okay if they just disappeared from the face of the earth. We have to do the work. Those of us who are not Indigenous, it is incumbent upon us to do the work of looking back and finding out who they were and paying attention to who they are, so that we can now walk beside them as we are, not telling them any longer how to behave, how to speak, how to, but learning from them. How do we relate to each other? Which may in the long run help us to figure out who we are. Because sometimes I think we pay too much attention to what everybody else is doing simply because we're not really sure who we are, what we're doing. But for whatever reasons, maybe I'm going back to Huron next week, but I'm really thinking about the work that has been done in the last 26 years of my ministry within the church. Not that I've done it, but work that's being done and work that needs to continue to be done. And I pray that we will walk faithfully so that we will get to a day when there will not be a need to think about red dress days or the residential schools, because we will have lived these generations beyond them to say never again. But we know, as we are seeing in the world right now, that the history that we forget is the history we will repeat. And so as Canadians, we need to never forget the history we have, the colonials with the Indigenous peoples, because we cannot afford to repeat that history. Thank you for hanging out with me here and helping me process my own stuff and the stuff of the church as we head into a season in which we are reflecting on who we are as church. God bless you. I'll see you again tomorrow for Church at Home with Rachel.